I used to believe family was built on blood and loyalty, but standing in the grand hall of Chicago's most lavish charity gala, calmly watching my mother-in-law's fake empire burn to ashes before 500 elite eyes, I realized the truth. Sometimes, family is the sharpest knife in your back. Push a woman into a corner to save her mother, and she will not just fight back. She will completely level your entire world. Hello to the amazing listeners of Violet Revenge Stories, and thank you so much for your continuous presence. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently turned off monetization for our channel, leaving us with absolutely zero budget to operate and produce these intense dramas. If you find yourself captivated by today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our dedicated team can afford their daily living expenses and continue creating for you. You can do this by simply scanning the QR code right on your screen or by clicking the donation link down in the video description or pinned comment. My name is Michaela Hughes. On the morning my entire reality fractured, I was sitting in my sterile, temperature-controlled cubicle on the 42nd floor of Ethos Dynamics. I was deep in the middle of analyzing a massive data migration project, staring at endless rows of numbers that suddenly meant absolutely nothing when my cell phone vibrated violently against the desk. The caller ID read, Chicago Memorial Hospital. The moment I swiped to answer, the air in my lungs just vanished. It was an emergency room physician. His voice was clinical but laced with a terrifying urgency. My mother, Eleanor, had suddenly collapsed in her kitchen from a severe, incredibly rare neurological flare-up. Her nervous system was rapidly shutting down. The doctor explained that the standard treatments were failing and that they had a maximum window of 24 hours to save her life. There was only one viable option left. A specialized, experimental counteragent existed, but it was currently held at a partner research institute in Indonesia. To reserve the dose and initiate the emergency medical transport flight, they needed an immediate wire transfer. The cost was exactly 80 million rupiah, which translated to roughly $5,000. My hands shook so violently that I nearly dropped the phone. $5,000 was not a small amount, and the hospital needed the transaction confirmation right that second before the international cutoff time. I hung up and immediately dialed my husband, Julian. He was right in the middle of his morning commute, stuck in the notorious gridlock of Interstate 90, when I stammered out the horrific news, crying hysterically into the receiver about the 24 hours and the 80 million rupiah. Julian did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I heard the sharp screech of tires as he aggressively pulled his car onto the highway shoulder. He did not ask a single questioning word. He did not ask for a second opinion. He simply opened his banking application and wired the $5,000 straight from our joint business account directly to the medical facility's international clearinghouse. "It is done, Michaela," he said, his voice a steady rock in my storm of panic. "I am on my way to the hospital right now. Just breathe." For exactly 10 minutes, a profound, exhausting relief washed over me. I grabbed my coat, practically running toward the Ethos Dynamics elevators. My mother was going to get the medicine. She was going to live. But that frail peace shattered exactly 10 minutes later. I was in a cab rushing downtown when Julian called me back and merged our call. His mother, Beatrice, was on the other line. Somehow, in her relentless need for control, Beatrice had secretly set up instantaneous push notifications for her son's business accounts, and she was furious. Her shrill, piercing voice exploded through the speakerphone, completely devoid of any human empathy. "Julian, what in God's name is an international transfer for $5,000 doing draining your account? Cancel it. Cancel it right this second." "Mother. Michaela's mother is in the intensive care unit," Julian tried to explain, raising his voice over the background traffic. "She is dying. That money is for emergency medication." Beatrice let out a sound of pure disgust. "Oh, please. Are you actually falling for this pathetic scam? That woman has been a drain on society her whole life. I will not have my son's hard-earned corporate funds wasted on those bottom-feeding leeches you call in-laws. I do not care what sob story they invented today. You call the bank, and you reverse that wire right now, or I swear to you, I will make your life a living hell." I sat in the back of the cab, paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated venom in her words. My mother was lying on a ventilator, fighting for every single breath, and Beatrice was throwing a tantrum over $5,000 that did not even belong to her. She wanted my mother to die to protect a bank balance. Julian went dead silent. The heavy breathing on his end was the only sound for a long moment. Then, with a voice colder than the Chicago winter wind, he spoke. "Do not ever speak about my wife's family again." He aggressively disconnected the call, cutting off Beatrice's frantic shrieking. He stayed on the line with me, his breathing heavy but controlled. "I am almost at the emergency room," he told me, his tone shifting back to gentle reassurance. "I am not canceling anything. I am with you." As my cab pulled up to the sterile white entrance of the hospital, I knew two things with absolute certainty. First, my husband was a good man, and second, the bridge between our home and his mother's empire had just been burned to the ground, leaving a permanent, jagged crack in the foundation of our family that could never, ever be repaired. The harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit waiting area cast a sickly pallor over everyone, except, of course, for my in-laws. They arrived not with comfort, but like they were making a red carpet debut at a funeral. Beatrice marched down the linoleum corridor draped in a pristine white Chanel tweed blazer that probably cost more than my mother's entire annual pension. Trailing closely behind her was Chloe, Julian's younger sister, wearing oversized Prada sunglasses indoors and tapping aggressively on her latest generation smartphone. They looked entirely alien in this space of suffering and bleach, completely detached from the very concept of human mortality. Before I could even stand up to greet them, Beatrice pointed a perfectly manicured, ruby-red fingernail directly at my face. She did not ask if my mother was breathing. She did not ask if the doctors had an update. "You are a master manipulator, Michaela," Beatrice spat, her voice echoing loudly enough to make a passing nurse flinch. "Using a sick old woman as bait to dig into my son's pockets. Do you have any idea what that $5,000 was earmarked for?" That was the exact initiation difference required to upgrade our family membership to the platinum tier at the Oak Brook Golf and Country Club. Julian was supposed to wire that to the club treasury this afternoon. And now, thanks to your little financial stunt, the wait list will push us back another 12 months. I stared at her, my eyes swollen, my mind struggling to process the sheer absurdity of her rage. A woman was clinging to life on a ventilator down the hall, and Beatrice was throwing a tantrum in a public hospital over a golf club membership. It was a terrifying glimpse into the rotten core of America's pseudo-elite, a world where maintaining a shiny, superficial facade completely erased basic human empathy. While Beatrice continued her venomous tirade, lecturing me about fiscal responsibility and the burden I placed on her son, I noticed a subtle movement. Chloe was standing slightly behind her mother, her smartphone angled perfectly toward me. She was not texting. The tiny green light next to her camera lens was active. I was sitting there, a crumpled, makeup-stained mess, sobbing silently while Beatrice berated me, and Chloe was recording every single humiliating second. I was too emotionally exhausted to fight back. I just turned my face away. I had no idea that within a few short hours, Chloe would take that raw footage of my lowest moment, slice it up with malicious editing software, and post it to her TikTok account. She layered a dramatic audio track over it and slapped on a bold text caption that read, "Watch my gold digger sister-in-law fake cry after scamming my brother out of thousands." Chloe, who had not worked a single legitimate day in her 23 years of life, was playing the victim for her invisible online audience. The digital execution was swift. The algorithm fed on the fake drama, pushing the video to hundreds of thousands of views by the next morning. By noon the following day, the digital witch hunt had bled into my real life. I was called directly into the glass-walled office of the Human Resources Director at Ethos Dynamics. The director, a woman who usually praised my quarterly data reports, slid a tablet across the table playing Chloe's viral smear campaign. She cleared her throat, adjusting her glasses with a look of corporate disappointment. Michaela, Aetherist Dynamics prides itself on maintaining a pristine corporate image, the director said, her tone devoid of warmth. While we understand you are dealing with family health issues, this kind of messy, viral personal scandal reflects poorly on our brand. Consider this a formal, verbal warning. We need you to handle your domestic disputes quietly, or we will have to reevaluate your position here. I walked out of that office feeling entirely hollowed out, realizing that in this corporate world, polished optics always triumphed over the ugly truth. When Julian found out about the corporate reprimand and the viral video, something inside him fundamentally snapped. That evening, he did not just argue with his family, he went to war. He marched into his mother's sprawling estate, completely ignoring the antique vases and velvet upholstery. I stood quietly by the doorway as he faced them down. "You are both utterly repulsive," Julian announced, his voice vibrating with a quiet, dangerous rage. He pulled out his phone, holding up his banking application. "Chloe, as of this exact second, your monthly $3,000 allowance is permanently canceled. You can figure out how to monetize your cruel little videos to pay for your designer bags." Chloe shrieked, dropping her phone on the Persian rug. "You cannot do that. I have car payments." "I just did," Julian replied coldly. He then turned his devastating gaze to Beatrice, who was already puffing her chest out to scream. "And Mother, you are banned from our home. If you ever come near Michaela again, if you ever try to sabotage her livelihood again, I will cut ties with you publicly and legally." Beatrice scoffed, trying to maintain her aristocratic air. "You are abandoning your own flesh and blood for a cheap grifter. You are throwing away our family legacy." Julian stepped dangerously close to his mother. He did not yell. He lowered his voice to a chilling whisper that carried through the massive, echoing foyer. "Do not push me, Mother. Do not force me to bring up who is really living on the blood and bones of others." The transformation was instantaneous. The arrogant, untouchable Beatrice turned completely pale. All the color drained from her perfectly contoured face, her jaw clamped shut tight, and for the first time in her loud, commanding life, she was left in absolute, terrified silence. The rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the ventilator was the only sound tethering me to sanity. Then, at exactly 2 a.m, the alarms surrounding my mother's bed began screaming. The piercing, high-pitched alerts shattered the quiet of the intensive care unit. A swarm of nurses rushed past me, pushing me violently against the cold corridor wall. Her blood pressure was plummeting rapidly. The neurological flare-up was accelerating significantly faster than the initial medical projections. I grabbed the attending physician the moment he stepped out of the room, demanding to know the estimated arrival time of the emergency transport flight from Indonesia. He looked down at his clipboard, his brow furrowed in severe, troubling confusion. "The shipment was halted," he said, his voice completely devoid of the desperate urgency I felt in my bones. "We received a direct notification from the International Medical Fund liaison just 4 hours ago. Someone claiming to be a senior family representative called the authorization board and officially withdrew the financial guarantee. The courier protocol was legally nullified. The medicine never even made it to the tarmac." My lungs completely forgot how to process oxygen. I stumbled back into the dimly lit waiting room and began making frantic, desperate phone calls. I bypassed the standard hospital customer service lines and utilized every single corporate investigative trick I knew from my time at Aetherist Dynamics to track the digital footprint of that cancellation order. It took me 3 grueling hours of navigating bureaucratic red tape to uncover the horrifying, sickening truth. The call to the medical board had bypassed all the standard verification protocols because it came from a private, unlisted number belonging to a senior board member of the Oak Brook Golf and Country Club. It was a man who happened to sit on the elite oversight committee for the International Medical Fund, a man who was a very close, personal socialite friend of Beatrice. She had actively weaponized her upper-crust social network in a fit of petty, vindictive rage over her son cutting off a monthly allowance. Beatrice had casually made a phone call over expensive cocktails to deliberately sever my mother's only lifeline. She had used her corrupt influence to legally sanction an execution, dressing it up as a simple administrative withdrawal by the family. I walked slowly back to the glass window of the intensive care unit. I stood there in the dead of the night, watching the fragile rise and fall of my mother's chest, watching the woman who had raised me single-handedly, slowly fading into a pale ghost beneath a terrifying tangle of plastic tubes. But as I pressed my palm against the freezing cold glass, something fundamental shifted inside my chest. I did not cry. My tear ducts were completely dry. The paralyzing fear that had gripped me for the past 48 hours simply evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying absolute clarity. The terrified, compliant daughter died right there on that sterile linoleum floor. What replaced her was something cold, highly calculating, and hungry for absolute destruction. I left the hospital building and drove straight through the empty streets to my mother's cramped, dilapidated apartment on the south side of the city. I desperately needed to understand the weapon Julian had inadvertently handed me the night before. I needed to understand the true, hidden meaning behind his chilling remark about who was truly living on the blood and bones of others. The apartment smelled faintly of stale herbal tea and old paper. I ignored the standard sentimental items and went straight for the heavy, rusted combination safe bolted to the floor of her bedroom closet. I knew the numerical code by heart. Inside, buried deeply beneath a thick stack of expired medical bills and eviction warnings, I found a heavy, tightly sealed manila envelope labeled with a date from exactly 5 years ago. I sat down on the worn-out living room rug, tearing the envelope open with shaking hands. The dim light from the street lamp outside illuminated a massive mountain of horrifying legal documents, bank statements, and internal audit reports from a highly prominent Chicago charity foundation. As my professionally trained eyes scanned the columns of numbers, the missing puzzle pieces violently locked into place. 5 years ago, Beatrice had served as the chief financial director for that exact charity. The financial ledgers clearly showed a systematic, highly sophisticated embezzlement scheme. She had funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars of donation money into offshore shell companies to secretly fund her lavish lifestyle, maintain her elite status, and purchase her sprawling estate. But Beatrice was never arrested. She was never even publicly charged. I dug deeper into the files, my breathing turning shallow as I pulled out a signed legal confession and a finalized judicial plea deal. The signature at the bottom did not belong to Beatrice. It belonged to my mother, Eleanor. At the time, my mother had been working as a low-level, part-time bookkeeper for the charity just to make ends meet. Julian had just graduated and was trying desperately to launch his own independent architecture firm. A massive federal fraud scandal involving his mother would have completely annihilated his reputation before his career even officially began. He would have been blacklisted from every major developer in the state. To protect her son-in-law, to ensure that the man I loved could build a safe future for us, my mother had struck a horrifying deal in the shadows. She took the absolute entirety of the blame. The documents outlined exactly how she had quietly confessed to the gross negligence and financial mismanagement. She had taken out a massive, crippling second mortgage on her own home to silently pay back a large portion of the stolen funds as restitution, accepting a harsh suspended prison sentence and permanent, irreversible ruin to her professional credibility. I sat there in the dark, the heavy silence of the apartment suffocating me. The pieces of the tragedy were no longer a mystery. They formed a clear, devastating picture of pure evil. My mother was not dying because of random bad luck. She was dying because the crushing poverty and unyielding stress of paying off Beatrice's crimes had entirely destroyed her physical immune system. She had sacrificed her health, her home, and her reputation to shield a monster. And how did that monster repay her? By picking up a phone and canceling the one medical transport that could save her life, all over a canceled shopping allowance for a spoiled brat. Beatrice's entire empire, her designer clothes, her country club memberships, her arrogant superiority, it was all bought and paid for with my mother's blood and freedom. I carefully gathered the papers, sliding them back into the envelope. The desperate, weeping girl was gone forever. I was a senior corporate data analyst. I specialized in tearing down massive, complex data systems and exposing their hidden structural flaws. Beatrice thought she had outsmarted a helpless, working-class old woman. She had completely forgotten about the daughter, and I was going to systematically dismantle her entire world, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, until there was absolutely nothing left but ash. I returned to our apartment just as the sun began to cast a sickly gray light over the Chicago skyline. Julian was sitting at the kitchen island, his eyes red and exhausted from pacing all night. I did not say a word. I simply walked over to the marble counter and dropped the heavy manila envelope between us. I spread the yellowed financial ledgers, the forged bank statements, and the signed confession across the surface. Julian reached out, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the judicial plea deal bearing my mother's signature. I stood entirely still, bracing myself for the defensive wall, the inherent instinct of a son to protect the woman who gave him life. I prepared for the excuses, the rationalizations, but as his eyes scanned the brutal, undeniable truth of what Beatrice had done exactly 5 years ago, the color drained entirely from his face. He did not offer a single excuse. Instead, the man I loved slowly lowered the papers, stepped around the counter, and collapsed onto his knees on the hardwood floor right in front of me. He wrapped his arms around my waist and buried his face in my coat, his shoulders shaking with a silent, devastating grief. He wept for the innocent woman suffering in a hospital bed because of his family's sins. When he finally looked up, his eyes were completely devoid of the gentle warmth I had known for years. They were as cold and hardened as mine. "We are going to tear it all down," Julian whispered, his voice steady and sharp, every single piece of it. The logical, immediate step would have been to take the evidence straight to the local police precinct. But as we sat across from each other, planning our next move, we realized that the criminal justice system was far too slow, and a quiet arrest in the middle of the night was far too merciful. Beatrice and Chloe did not fear a courtroom nearly as much as they feared public humiliation. Their entire existence, their oxygen, was built on their elite reputation and the fake adoration of hundreds of thousands of strangers on the internet. To truly destroy them, we had to systematically dismantle their social capital while the whole world was watching. I opened my laptop and connected to a secure, encrypted server. My daily job at Aetherist Dynamics involved tracking massive, international data migrations and identifying microscopic anomalies in corporate financial structures. Turning those specialized skills against a 23-year-old social media influencer was like bringing a military-grade laser to a knife fight. I started with the viral video Chloe had posted of me, using basic metadata extraction. I traced the digital footprint back to her primary linked accounts, then initiated a deep dive into her public transaction histories and the hidden digital wallets she used to fund her extravagant lifestyle. It took me exactly 4 hours of uninterrupted data mining to completely shatter the polished facade of her internet persona. The reality of Chloe's wealth was genuinely pathetic. The designer bags, the luxury vacations, the endless stream of high-end cosmetics were not funded by family trust funds. They were entirely financed through a highly organized, underground credit card fraud ring. I mapped out a clear, undeniable data trail showing Chloe purchasing stolen credit card numbers in bulk from hidden forums, using them to buy luxury goods, and then laundering the money through fake promotional sponsorships. Even worse, to keep up the cash flow when the stolen cards were flagged and declined. She had borrowed heavily from predatory, high-interest loan sharks operating out of Nevada. She was drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of illegal, compounding debt. We now held the absolute destruction of both mother and daughter in our hands, but we needed the final hammer to drop with official, inescapable authority. Julian reached out to a private investigator he had retained for a corporate security audit 2 years ago. Through that discreet connection, we were quietly introduced to a specific federal agent operating within the Financial Crimes Division of the Bureau. We met the agent at a nondescript diner just outside the city limits. As it turned out, Federal investigators had been quietly monitoring the suspicious financial fluctuations of both Beatrice and Chloe for over 18 months. They knew the women were running illicit operations, but Beatrice was incredibly careful with her paper trails, and the agency lacked the core, undeniable proof required to secure judicial search warrants. I slid a secured digital drive across the diner table. It contained the complete, unredacted financial history of the embezzlement from 5 years ago, explicitly cross-referenced with my mother's forced confession, alongside the comprehensive data map of Chloe's current credit card fraud syndicate. The agent looked at the files on his encrypted tablet, his eyes widening in pure disbelief as he verified the routing numbers. We had just handed him a fully loaded weapon with the safety turned off. The evidence was irrefutable, completely bypassing the need for a lengthy discovery phase. We established a strict, non-negotiable timeline with the authorities for the arrests. We needed one specific stage. 2 days later, a heavy cream-colored envelope arrived at our front door. It was embossed with gold foil. It was a formal invitation to the annual Chicago Philanthropic Gala, the most exclusive and heavily photographed charity event of the entire season. Beatrice was the reigning head of the organizing committee. Inside the invitation was a handwritten note from Beatrice, dripping with arrogant confidence. She demanded that Julian attend the gala to make a public statement distancing himself from my family. She was orchestrating a massive public spectacle, intending to corner Julian in front of the city's billionaires, the press, and the prominent board members of his own architectural firm. She wanted to force him to officially announce our divorce to protect their elite legacy. She had set the perfect stage for her ultimate triumph. She had absolutely no idea she had just built her own scaffold. The evening of the charity gala was wrapped in a suffocating layer of artificial elegance. The grand ballroom of the downtown Plaza Hotel was drowning in crystal chandeliers, imported white orchids, and the clinking of champagne flutes held by the most powerful billionaires in the city. Julian and I stepped out of our town car into a blinding storm of flashing camera bulbs. This was the exact moment the performance had to be absolutely flawless. We walked down the red carpet with miles of space between us. Julian kept his posture rigid, his jaw clenched, projecting the exact image of a man burdened by an unbearable domestic mistake. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the floor, my shoulders hunched, completely stripping away any trace of the confident corporate analyst I actually was. I played the part of the defeated, exhausted wife about to be discarded. The visual trick worked instantly. As soon as we crossed the threshold into the main hall, Beatrice spotted us. She was holding court near the center stage, draped in a custom emerald gown that practically screamed of stolen money. When she saw my submissive posture and Julian's cold distance, a look of pure, intoxicating triumph washed over her face. She genuinely believed she had broken me. She believed her cruel manipulation at the hospital had successfully driven the final, fatal wedge between her son and his working-class burden. She did not waste a single second capitalizing on her perceived victory. Beatrice paraded Chloe through the sea of tuxedoed investors and tech moguls like a prized show pony. Chloe, wearing a diamond necklace that was undoubtedly financed by a stolen platinum card, giggled and nodded as her mother introduced her to venture capitalists. Every time they passed near me, Beatrice made sure her voice carried just loudly enough for the surrounding elite to hear. "It is just a tragedy, truly," Beatrice whispered loudly to a prominent real estate developer, casting a look of utter disgust in my direction. Julian was completely blinded by her, but thankfully, the boy has finally woken up to the reality of her financial draining. She will be out of his house and back to the slums by Monday morning. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and simply nodded my head lower, clutching my cheap evening bag tightly. My absolute silence only fed their towering arrogance. While Beatrice was busy assassinating my character to the upper crust of society, Chloe was busy feeding her digital ego. She had assigned a hired assistant to follow her around with a professional lighting ring, broadcasting a live video stream directly to her social media accounts. Over 300,000 people were currently watching her sip vintage champagne and brag about the exclusive guest list, completely oblivious to the fact that she was actively live streaming her own imminent destruction to the entire world. The heavy arrogance in the room provided the perfect cover, while Julian dutifully shook hands with his firm's board members, acting the part of the compliant heir. I slipped away from the crowded ballroom floor. I moved silently down a dimly lit service corridor behind the main stage, with my security access knowledge from corporate tech installations. Picking the flimsy lock on the audio and visual control room took less than 30 seconds. The room was empty. The technician was out by the catering tables taking a quick break. I approached the massive master control console that fed the towering 60-foot digital screen dominating the ballroom. I pulled a sleek black flash drive from my evening bag. It felt incredibly heavy, loaded with enough digital dynamite to level a dynasty. I plugged it directly into the primary input port. My fingers flew across the control keyboard, quickly bypassing the standard firewall and overriding the scheduled video loop. I synced the display trigger to a hidden remote application on Julian's phone. A small, invisible wire was now stretched tight across the room, waiting to be tripped. Everything was set. I slipped back out, perfectly blending into the crowd, just as the formal dinner chimes began to ring. The lights in the grand hall dimmed to a soft, dramatic blue. The murmurs of the elite crowd hushed as the spotlight violently swung to the center stage. Julian walked up the carpeted steps to the mahogany podium. He adjusted the microphone, looking out over the sea of incredibly wealthy, expectant faces. The silence in the room was absolute, a perfect canvas for the destruction that was about to unfold. Chloe pushed her way to the very front row, her camera angled perfectly to capture her brother. Beside her, Beatrice stood tall, her chest puffed out, an impossibly smug, victorious smile plastered across her face. She locked eyes with me across the room, giving me a tiny, mocking wave. She was waiting for the grand finale. She was waiting for her son to loudly declare his absolute loyalty to the family legacy and cast me out into the cold. Julian gripped the edges of the mahogany podium. The brilliant spotlight cast sharp shadows across his face. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. Down in the front row, Beatrice adjusted her emerald gown, her chin tilted upward in pure arrogance, fully expecting her son to deliver the final crushing blow to my existence. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and esteemed members of the board," Julian began, his voice echoing powerfully through the crystal-clear audio system. "We are gathered here tonight under the pretense of honoring philanthropic legacies. My mother, Beatrice, has always taught me that a family's reputation is its most valuable asset. She insisted that tonight, I stand before you and make a statement about excising a cancerous burden from our lives." Beatrice offered a modest, theatrical nod to the billionaires standing beside her. She practically glowed under the stage lights. "But a true legacy," Julian's voice suddenly dropped an octave, turning razor-sharp and dangerously cold, "cannot be built on a foundation of stolen wealth and the destroyed lives of innocent people." The smug smile instantly vanished from Beatrice's face. A ripple of profound confusion swept through the sea of tuxedos and silk evening gowns. Julian did not look at his mother. He looked directly at me. "Tonight, I need to publicly thank a woman who is currently fighting for her life in a hospital bed across the city. Eleanor gave up absolutely everything she had to protect my future, and tonight, we return the favor." Without another word, Julian reached into his tuxedo jacket, pulled out his smartphone, and firmly pressed the trigger button on the screen. Behind him, the massive 60-foot LED display abruptly flickered. The elegant charity logo vanished. In its place, projected in blinding, undeniable high definition, was the confidential judicial plea deal from exactly 5 years ago. Next to it appeared the heavily redacted bank statements, the offshore account routing numbers, and a massive, zoomed-in image of the forged signature. The collective gasp from the 500 elite guests sounded like all the oxygen being violently sucked out of the room. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped entirely. I stepped out from the shadows of the crowd. The sea of wealthy investors instinctively parted for me as I walked purposefully down the center aisle. ascending the carpeted stairs to the stage. Julian stepped back, silently handing me the microphone. "What you are looking at," I said, my voice completely steady, ringing with an icy authority that sent a visible shockwave through the room, "is the documented proof of a grand illusion. 5 years ago, Beatrice embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from the very charities you all so generously fund to save herself from federal prison. She manipulated and forced a vulnerable, working-class bookkeeper to take the fall. That bookkeeper is my mother, who is currently hospitalized because Beatrice deliberately canceled her life-saving medical transport just 2 days ago, simply out of petty spite." "Turn it off!" Beatrice shrieked, her perfectly composed aristocratic mask completely dissolved, revealing the rabid, terrified animal underneath. "Someone cut the main power right now. She is lying. It is a deep fake." I did not even flinch. I simply tapped a key on the podium interface. The screen shifted again. This time, it displayed a complex, undeniable web of data charts. "And since we are exposing illusions tonight," I continued, staring directly into the glowing lens of Chloe's live stream camera, "to the hundreds of thousands of viewers currently watching Chloe online, your favorite wealthy influencer is a complete fraud. Her designer wardrobe and luxury vacations are entirely financed by an illegal, underground credit card theft ring. She is currently drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt to predatory loan sharks. You are watching a criminal syndicate masquerading as high society." Chloe dropped her glass of vintage champagne. It shattered against the marble floor. She stared at her phone screen in absolute, paralyzing horror as thousands of live comments flooded the feed, tearing her digital empire apart in real time. "You little wretch!" Beatrice roared. She completely snapped. She hiked up the skirt of her custom emerald gown and charged up the stage stairs, her hands curled into claws, aiming directly for my face. But she never even made it to the second step. The prominent real estate developer and the tech mogul she had been trying to impress just minutes ago physically stepped into her path. Disgusted by the undeniable financial evidence glowing above them, the developer violently shoved Beatrice backward. She lost her footing and tumbled onto the red carpet in a humiliating, tangled mess of expensive silk and desperate fury. Right at that exact moment, the heavy gold-plated doors of the grand ballroom were forcefully thrown open. The loud, commanding voices of federal agents cut through the chaotic murmurs of the elite crowd. Over a dozen men and women in dark windbreakers bearing the letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation marched directly onto the ballroom floor. The lead agent, the exact man we had met at the diner, walked straight up to Beatrice. "Beatrice," the agent announced loudly, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for grand financial fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement. Chloe, you are under arrest for cyber credit fraud and federal racketeering. You both have the right to remain silent, a right I highly suggest you start using immediately." The cameras of the elite press flashed relentlessly. Chloe wailed hysterically as the cold steel snapped around her wrists. Beatrice was completely catatonic, her eyes wide with sheer disbelief as she was roughly pulled to her feet and marched out through the crowd of her former peers, who now looked at her like she was carrying a plague. The fake empire was completely, utterly incinerated. 3 days later, the sterile smell of the hospital room was replaced by the faint, sweet scent of the fresh flowers Julian had brought. The experimental medication had worked flawlessly. I stood beside the bed, holding my mother's warm, living hand as her chest rose and fell in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Her eyes fluttered open, tired but full of life. Julian stood on the other side of the bed, his hand resting securely on my shoulder. The television in the corner of the room was muted, broadcasting the breaking news of Beatrice and Chloe being denied bail by a federal judge. The nightmare was finally over. The villains were locked behind cold iron bars, entirely stripped of the wealth and status they had stolen. And as I looked at my husband and my mother, the only true family I had left, I knew I had proven the most important lesson of all. Kindness and humility are never a weakness to be trampled on. But when you cross the boundary of love and threaten the people I hold dear, I will not hesitate to burn your entire world to the ground. Thank you so very much to all our wonderful listeners for staying with me through this incredible journey. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please let me know in the comments. If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider helping our channel. We currently have no monetization, and our dedicated team relies solely on your kindness. By donating just $1, you can help us pay our hardworking staff so they can feed their families and continue bringing you the high-quality stories you love. You can scan the donation QR code right here on the screen, or click the direct link provided in the video description and pinned comment below. Your support means the absolute world to us. Thank you again, and stay safe.